Alrighty, well, it's 5 o'clock, so looks like we could probably get started here. So my name's Trenton Butz. I'm a third-year statistics student at OSU, and I'll be moderating the sports media panel here. We've got Neil Johnson, who's a sports analytics developer at ESPN. We also have Josh Hermsmeyer, a football writer and analyst at 538. We have Alison Lukan, a freelance data-driven storyteller covering the NHL. We have Brian MacDonald, the director of sports analytics at ESPN. Also, we have Seth Partnow, who covers the NBA and basketball analytics for The Athletic, and Sara Ziegler, the sports editor at 538. Can you guys all hear me okay? Everything pretty good? Awesome. So as I've already mentioned, several of you have already had panels, so we've gotten to hear a lot of exposition from you. But I believe Brian and Sara have not yet been on a panel, so I'll kind of field the same question to both of you. And we'll start with Brian. So you're the director of sports analytics at ESPN. How did you come to be the director of sports analytics at ESPN? I'm imagining it's not a linear path. There's been a lot of stuff you've gone through. So can you kind of take us through your path and then your position now?
Yeah, it was highly nonlinear, I would say. So to use a math term. So I guess, so I kind of got into sports analytics in the 2000s, I guess. I was a grad student studying mathematics. I did not, I liked it a lot, but I knew that I didn't want to continue doing more theoretical mathematics. I want to do something more applied. I was following the Moneyball revolution throughout that decade in baseball. My favorite sport was hockey, though, and there wasn't much stuff done in hockey, which was good because that meant there was a lot of low-hanging fruit. So good place to start learning analytics, data science, statistics, and stuff like that. So kind of started working on that there. My first job out of grad school was I was a professor at West Point teaching math and stats, and that's really when I started doing a lot of hockey analytics stuff. Started doing things publicly. Eventually got a job offer from the Florida Panthers and went there and worked for them for 4 years. I was at University of Miami for a year after that, teaching business analytics, and then eventually heard about the position at ESPN through someone that works on the team. I'm now his boss, actually. So that's fun. But Brian Burke, many of you probably know him, football analytics guru, or the godfather of football analytics.
The football one, not the hockey one.
Yes, sorry. The football Brian Burke, not the hockey Brian Burke. Yeah, I had met him on a panel just like this, except in person, a few years back, and he just reached out, said, "Hey, you interested? There's this opening, you should apply." So applied, eventually got a offer and moved up to Connecticut last July. So that's how that all sort of came to be. I think that was is that the only question? I forget.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Absolutely. Okay. Right. So Sara, you kind of come from a different part of the world of sports media. You're the sports editor at 538. So, but do you find that your path as well is nonlinear and that you've been through a lot of different things to get to where you are now?
Yeah, well, so my path was more just through a traditional journalism path. I started working at a newspaper right out of college and worked at that same newspaper for 15 years. At the same time that newspapers were dying. And so then I left print media. I feel like that was a wise decision. 538, so I had started reading Nate Silver, my boss, back in the early 2000s when he was writing for Baseball Prospectus. And I didn't come from a stats background, but I did want to win my fantasy baseball league. And Baseball Prospectus gave me a lot of I was like determined to beat all the dudes I was playing in my fantasy baseball league. So I started reading Baseball Prospectus and started reading Nate and followed his career. And when he started 538, that had always been sort of a dream of mine to work at. So sports, I didn't really work as much in sports in journalism until I got to 538. I was a sports fan always, but hadn't done the kind of grind of, covering, the preps and all of that. I had been more on the news side until I got to 538. And then I started as an editor, a copy editor within sports, and then was promoted to sports editor.
Awesome. Thanks guys for sharing that. So also I wanted to mention at the start, if any attendees have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'd love to reference them and bring them up during the panel. So, but for now, I'm going to go to Alison here. And I don't want to spend the entire panel talking about COVID, but I feel like we would be remiss if we didn't mention the impact that it's had on the business of sports media. So I'll ask you, how have you been able to continue to find story ideas, given that there's been so many significant stretches this year without sport?
Yeah, I think it's been a very interesting time, and I think we get to take this time to do a lot of projects that maybe we didn't get to do in the past. I have a couple of big things that I've finally been able to dive into that before we haven't been able to do. And to that end, from a data perspective, I think it can really be a time of innovation, even if it's about fine tuning concepts, and I think because we have the time, things are being discussed more fairly, as opposed to maybe how sometimes discussion can go on some of these concepts. But I think it's about looking into things you haven't been able to look at before, digging into theory, see if it applies to a team or a player or a system that you maybe haven't done before, round out how you're analyzing things. I've been able to do a lot more video work than I get to do usually in the regular season. You really just have to challenge yourself to ask the questions about the game that maybe you haven't. The biggest obstacle has been we don't have access maybe as much as we did to players, to people within organizations. I love to validate ideas with those people and talk about the concepts truly in application in sport. And I think that's been something that has been harder for us to get in this time.
Awesome. So Seth, do you want to chime in on that? Or like finding story ideas through the times of COVID?
It took a little bit during kind of the shutdown. It took a little bit to get going, but then I'm sure we all have a stack or several stacks high of when I have time for projects, and just getting to chip away at a few of those kind of evergreen ideas that when you're in the rough and tumble of a season, you don't necessarily have time to slow down and look at. So even something as simple as an idea that comes to you as a distraction from commenting your code can then lead to an idea just to do anything but that. So it was hard, but at a certain point, the kind of the creativity of I wonder takes back over, and you can start to look at some very broad topics related to the sport, rather than specific breakdowns of players or games or teams or things like that.
Right. So Josh, do you find something similar? Like, is there anything you could tell us about a project that you've worked on during COVID that you might not have been able to get to had this all not happened?
Well, I'm in the middle of one right now that is a lot of fun. I don't know how much I should talk about it, Sara, but yeah, no. So I have been able to do kind of, we call it a big swing, and I have been able to do a little bit of a big swing right now, and I'm in the midst of it. But during COVID, one of the cool things that I found about just our data science-y, data journalism based, the thrust of what we do at 538 is I was able to do some stuff on COVID itself, and the fact that 538 gave me the ability and the outlet to do that was really cool. And I think it also speaks to kind of the Swiss Army knife nature of this kind of data journalism, and that you can apply your tool set to different types of problems, and I think that's really cool.
Awesome. So Neil, I'll kind of field a similar question to you, but it'll be a bit different. So from the analytics perspective, how has not having data for a big portion of this year during COVID affected your analysis? Like, obviously you've maybe gotten a better chance to go back and look at last year's data, or you've done something else with data that's already been out there before COVID. Can you kind of speak to that?
So obviously it increases your uncertainty in things, right? But what it has largely done for our team specifically is had us constantly scrambling to apply hot fixes and band-aids to code we already have. We have statistical models for, college and pro basketball and football, and they weren't necessarily designed for NBA games to be played at a neutral site, let alone 100 plus of them. They weren't designed to not have fans in them. Like, that's, I guess, one of the larger questions we've been pondering this whole time, is the effect of fans for home field advantage, right? This is such a great opportunity for people to then run with that and do some good analysis on it. But from our perspective, yeah, we've just had, I mean, having all the games get, constantly getting canceled and getting rescheduled. And then like right now for football, it's trying to figure out all of the new rules and tiebreakers around like for college football conference championship games. Like the NFL is looking at allowing more teams into their playoff structure. So for us, we've honestly just been trying to keep our head above water, trying to apply fixes to make sure our code still makes sense and to make sure the projections are still logical, given so much honestly radical change with what's gone on in sports at both of those levels.
Absolutely. All right, thanks guys. So I'll kind of switch gears here if no one else. Gear one towards Seth. Something that he brought up before leading up to the conference that I'd like to bring up here. So obviously there's a huge difference between quantitative and qualitative data with it for it to be right. But the same can't really be said for qualitative data, obviously, such as the eye test. People might not agree on certain things that you find out about qualitative data. So to that end, to what extent is it important to integrate qualitative data into your analysis? It can't be like a universal truth.
So a big part of it is actually, I think that a lot of what we all do on some level is to try to break the wall down between the two. It's not a binary. This is qualitative. This is quantitative. Anything that is measured is an abstraction to some degree, and there's some kind of implicit assumptions in there that actually have some qualitative components to them. So part of it is again, not saying, well, it's the eye test and the stats. It's like, well, the stats and it's a continuum of things. And I think that if I can, Alison in particular is really excellent about finding a stat, taking it to video, and bringing it back and forth that way. So you're giving, the whole picture really, because when we're talking about sports, we're not talking about math. We're not talking about statistics. Even if we're talking about sports statistics, we're talking about the sport. And so if we can't marry the number to the game that people see, it may be intellectually interesting, but I don't think it drives passion in the way that sports fandom is meant to do. So merging the two is if to my mind the best way of not just bridging that gap, but illustrating that there's no gap there.
Would you like to jump in on that, maybe to echo what Seth said or to bring a different perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think merging those two things is pretty important. Like if you are, for example, part of a team, you might have this is maybe not even that qualitative either, but like scouts ratings, for example, that's taking their eye tests, some sort of qualitative assessment and making it numeric. So, I mean, it's sort of like not an objective numeric rating. It's like a subjective numeric rating, but it's, so it's not exactly, I guess, what you guys were talking about, but the idea that if you can take information where you think it's valuable information from two sources that are fairly different, but both are like, you feel that both independently are pretty valuable. It's often really helpful to combine those two things. It's kind of like, what's the term when you use several different kinds of models? Consensus modeling, ensemble modeling, ensemble methods, I guess. This is kind of like a ensemble method. You're building models. You're taking information from different independent sources where you think both sources are good and combining them together, and that tends to be very helpful.
Yeah, and if I can add just one thing, a colleague of mine, Carolyn Wilkie, has a great term for qualitative, I guess we should say, and she calls them instead unmeasured characteristics. My degree is actually in leadership studies, and I think that we sell ourselves short when we think there are things we can't measure, and that's not, as Seth said, to take the passion out of it. If we had a team or an organization that wanted to go in this direction, there are surveys, there are tools to measure leadership, to measure grit, to look at things like this. And I think that there's a really compelling challenge about saying everything is measurable. It just may not look binary, you know, ones and zeros, like maybe we're used to thinking of it, and bringing in comments like Brian just made, we can look at these things across a spectrum and still find a way to quantify them and apply them to sport with passion, as Seth said.
Great. So I'll kind of ask a similar question to Josh, but it's a little bit different. So when you're writing articles and you're presenting your models to the public, how do you find the balance between like maintaining the statistical rigor of your models and allowing even the most casual fan to read them? Obviously, that's a balance that takes many years to perfect. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's where editors and collaboration really come in, because I can get in the weeds pretty deep, and making sure that, you know, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is communicate an idea, you know, with an economy of words and without using jargon. That's really kind of what 538 is all about. And so and also amazing visuals. But I think, yeah, the problem really is you want to have that rigor, so that when you talk to your friends and all the work that you put in, you want it to achieve certain goals that maybe the readership isn't even cognizant of. You know, like I want my models to be predictive. I want them, if someone reads one of my articles, I want someone to be able to take it away and maybe even put money on it in terms of betting, because it actually does do something. It does say something important about the future. And you know, so that's a bias of my own, and that probably comes into my writing and the types of problems I choose to try and answer. Yeah, no, I think finding that balance takes, as you say, a lot of experience, and thankfully, I think all of us here have good editorial teams that help us find that balance.
So Sarah, I'll kind of spin that to you as an editor. So how do you know what to parse out of what you're sent? Like, how do you keep these analysts from getting too nerdy, so to speak?
I'm not sure 538 can get too nerdy for what we are trying to do. In fact, there was somebody commented once on a story of Josh's pretty recently that was like, you know, wanting more information about something in the model and wishing we had put it in the story. It's like we're always fighting that battle of like of making things understandable and not getting too you know, too wonky or whatever, but also giving people who our audience is, you know, is a little bit more of an analytical audience and will want that kind of information. So it's a tough balance to strike. But, you know, for me, I go back to just good storytelling, and we're using data, of course, and we're using it in interesting and, you know, exciting ways, but really we want to be good storytellers. And so that's where it all comes back to, that we're weaving a good story and making a compelling narrative that people are going to want to know more about, regardless of whether they understand, you know, modeling. You know, they probably don't. They might, but they probably don't. And so we want to tell good stories regardless of that.
Alrighty, so I see a question in the Q&A, and I think its target is Brian. And the thesis of the question is kind of, how challenging is it to find the right space and platform to present consumers with analytics content? So obviously you have people with differing levels of proficiency in analytics. How do you use your platform to present analytics in the way that you think you can, you know, convince most people that what you're saying is correct?
Geez, I don't know if I have a good answer for that question. So let's see. Could you summarize that again, or maybe I can read that myself?
Yeah, maybe you can get the gist of it, or we can move on. It went in the answered. It is at the bottom. He talks about Bill Connolly and watching fans of whichever team melt down about their SP Plus ranking. And then his question is, how challenging is it to find the right space and platform to present the right consumer with analytics content? Obviously, because your audience is so large.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think, okay. You know, you have to, I don't know, like do your best, but no matter what you say in public, you know, there's going to be people who disagree with it. And, you know, even people who are very analytics friendly, or they're analytics, you know, they're analysts themselves, they'll disagree with what you say. I have really good conversations with people internally about things, and we disagree. So like a lot of the stuff that we talk about isn't always cut and dry, even if we're using objective data with, fixed, tried and true statistical methods and so on. There's certain parts of the process that are not black and white. They're gray areas. And knowing the right questions to ask, knowing what are the things that we actually want to measure, and if we build this model or create this metric, what is this metric actually really telling us about a player or a team? It's all these kinds of things that where you're trying to like translate some real world question to like something technical, and then do a bunch of technical stuff and then translate it back to the real world question. Not that the technical stuff isn't the real world, but I just mean, some non-technical questions, some sports, some, industry specific question. That whole process, there's gray area in that process. So there's going to be disagreements no matter what you do. You just kind of have to do your best, explain exactly what you're doing. And let the person decide for themselves. There may not be a right answer. None of the models that we create are going to be perfect. I way overuse this quote, but I'm going to use it anyway. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So apologies for everyone who's heard that like 100 times, but it's true. So I'm just going to keep using it. Yeah. So I guess that'd be what I would, that'd be how I would respond.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great answer. So I'll field the next question to Josh, and maybe I'll go for a little bit of a more specific question. So you've obviously had great success with your air yards by low model, which is a weekly column that helps us identify pass catchers in the NHL or in the NFL who have underperformed relative to their opportunity. So how did you originally get an idea for a model like that? How did those ideas come about? And what does it take for those models to have success? What makes some more successful than others, so to speak?
So, I mean, that model was me trying to solve a problem that I had, and that people like Sara talked about how she wanted to win her fantasy league. Well, I wanted to win my fantasy leagues. I wanted to win a DFS, and I think that kind of motivation to solve a problem that some burning problem that you want to see the answer to, I think is typically what motivates the more successful models. And the reason why isn't because it gives you any kind of like stupendous insight. It's that you iterate so much, and you have this feedback loop of, did it work this time? Well, I still want this good answer, so I'm going to keep on iterating, and I'm going to keep on taking the feedback, and then you hone it into something that can withstand the rigors of out of sample data. So I think it's I think that's the best answer about it. I could generalize about how a model like that might come to be. But certainly the air yards by low model was just because I wanted to find a way to figure out which wide receivers were likely to do good and were underpriced, because finding market inefficiencies is obviously one of the things we were all pretty interested in.
Hey, can I add on to a point on that, if I may?
Please do.
I think the thing Josh said that was really the most important about that is, and this is probably something for the students watching to know, is that if you're taking on a project that you're interested in, something that rather than having something assigned to you, because you have that curiosity about it, you're more likely to ask yourself the next question. You're more likely to pre-investigate the doubts that someone might have about your model, and that's what's going to really make it more robust and better. Is you're almost playing devil's advocate with yourself. Whereas if it's just something that's assigned to you, it's like, oh well, here's a model that says X, Y, and Z, and now I'm done. But if it's something you're really interested intellectually in finding out, you're going to do your best work because you're going to take that extra step to really self-critique.
Sure. So I'll go over to Neil. How do you find the difference between models that are likely to have success and models that are likely to just stay as ideas? Like where is the traction that comes from the successful model?
I mean, it all depends on your buy-in, right? I think Seth hit the nail on the head there, which is it all depends on how invested or bought in the people working on it are. I think pretty much everybody on this panel is a person who's is, curious about answering questions that aren't answered yet in their sport, and they took on the initiative to try to find those answers themselves. That's certainly how I kind of got my jump into working in sports, for sure. So that's where, for students in general, just stay curious, try to solve things that you can't find answers for, and then let the world know about it, because I guess typically things are kind of done behind closed doors already, but if you do it in the public space first, that's still notable. And it's something that, a lot of work is never absolute and finished. We're always looking to continuously improve upon methods, approaches, et cetera, et cetera. So if you take someone else's, or something that's already been done, but you do it in a new and novel way, that's just as interesting as a new idea as well. So that's what I always try to tell students in general, is just whatever you're interested in, whether it's something that's been done or not, just pursue it, and pursue it to like the nth degree, and let everybody know about it.
Great. So I'll kind of give a little bit of a different question here, and this one is to Sara. So I was listening to the episode of Hot Takedown from this week, which is, if people don't know about this, it's a podcast that Sara does. It's a weekly podcast for 538. And so a specific idea I found was, you touched on the fact that, this is kind of paraphrasing a little bit, when you cover sports, teams that are supposed to be good and are actually good, it's not that they're not interesting, it's just that they're good. So what do you say about them? How can you kind of describe the struggle of talking about teams that are just performing exactly to expectations? And does the media have like a duty to give more airtime to these teams, or maybe not?
Well, first, thanks for listening. The podcast is Hot Takedown. Everyone go subscribe, and then review and rate, right? That's my shtick every week. No, so yeah, we were talking about the Chiefs because it's to the point now where we kind of are taking Patrick Mahomes for granted because he's so good. And the same with Russell Wilson, although the Seahawks are more interesting because they're so up and down. But you run out of ways to say Russell Wilson is really good, Patrick Mahomes is really good, right? And I think during the course of a season, with the ebbs and flows of a season, it's you're looking to cover the interesting story and the underdog and the underperforming team or whatever. And so the like high performing, like boring teams, I think can get kind of lost in the middle of a season. I think that's true of any sport too. When a team is just really good, the Dodgers in like the middle of the season weren't really being talked about because you were talking more about the teams that were going to, were in the playoff hunt and that kind of thing. But then when the playoffs came around, then it's, what's going on with the Dodgers? Why haven't they, swept every series, whatever. So I think that's just part of finding good stories during a season. I don't know that there's a duty to cover the best teams or even cover the same teams in the same way. The storylines are sort of going to come and go, and it's important to like ground them in the data for us anyway, at 538, where we're gonna, talk about maybe the Chiefs looked a little bad against the Panthers, but these are the numbers. They're still, doing very well. They've improved in this way. Their expected points added are greater than last year at this time, whatever. So if you ground yourself in the numbers and in the data, then the narratives don't like kind of spin out of control. And I'm also like, the other point that I was trying to make in the podcast was, when we get to the playoffs, we will turn back to the Chiefs. It's not that we're just going to ignore them for the rest of the season. They're obviously an important, compelling part of this season.
Sure. So Alison, maybe would you like to chime in on that? Like how do stories kind of present themselves as the sports season rolls along? And is it naturally in the teams that are better and more entertaining to watch, or is it maybe even better to have a story based on an underdog team that overperforms?
Yeah, I think you can spin it both ways. And it's something Sara said really struck a chord with me. Sometimes a team or a player doing something to expectations, at least with my audience, gives me an opportunity to educate on a concept or a measure. So maybe someone is really good at X, and so I get to introduce my audience to this measure that measures X. or to a new metric or a new visual or a way to see the data applied. And I will say, as a journalist, I like celebrating good too. So I think that is something fun to do. But I do think that the exceptions are what draw the most interest, whether it's don't go jump off a ledge, your team is fine, or go jump off a ledge because your team is doing everything good and they're still losing. And again, I think that what the challenge becomes is that you don't want to dive into 15 reasons why. I always like to focus on one or two things at a time, one or two core concepts that I'm trying to explore, and drive the answer that way. And then you have more articles too, because you only are doing one little metric at a time.
Josh, does that kind of resonate with you, like one or two things at a time, despite, whatever theme you might want to go with? If a team is overperforming or underperforming, like one or two things, is that like the formula?
I love it. I wish I feel like I had the confidence that I could get away with it. Like, I feel like I would just be upbraided. You missed this, What about this, man? Hey, and that's kind of, that heat. Well, I enjoy it. I do enjoy the battle online when we talk about sports. I think because it's largely inconsequential, it's this kind of, fun way to have these, intellectual debates. I do, in the back of my head, I hear those people, what about this? What about this? And so I think I think I may have a flaw that I am too comprehensive sometimes, but that is a great point she makes.
So Neil, I'll go back to you. You kind of mentioned the public buy-in perspective to a model a little bit earlier. Do you have an example, or really does anyone have an example, an open question, of a metric or model that you really believed works, but you just couldn't get the buy-in?
So, I mean, we have a very recent one that's been very divisive in NFL circles, which is Aaron MacDonald in our pass rush win rate model. So that's where
Aaron Donald.
Sorry, Aaron Donald, yes.
Brian MacDonald, Aaron Donald.
Yeah, so that's where the headline said that he might not be as good as we think he is at a specific part of his job. And people took that as saying he's not the best defensive player in the league or something. But if you were to read the full article and understand the methodology behind it, you would understand that it's telling a much more insightful story, which is that is certainly expectations and the sentiment that we all hold, that is the reputation he has, but there's a part of his game that is a little suboptimal. He loves to run past the quarterback in certain situations, and it seems like sometimes the opponents are aware of that. So that's something that, like, it's tough because obviously we're on one side of it, and the others, we have to hope that the other side of it is more open to it, is able to read into the nuance fully. Not that they always have to or anything, but yeah, that's where I think everybody on this panel understands you're not going to bat 1,000 with all of the content you put out there. You just need to be fully invested and trustworthy of what you do put out there and go to bat for it. So that's where we stood with it. We still believe in it. We're certainly going to hear productive criticisms of any of our work because we want to make our work better. But for stuff that is a little bit more destructive, we're going to kind of, let that fall off to the side, so to speak.
Wait, people are supposed to read the full article? Do people know that?
Yeah, and to be fair, I think that article was behind a paywall, so I do understand that somewhat. But at the same time, it's just, we weren't saying he was bad. We were just saying there was a part of his game that it was average. It was a league average. And we now have a way to measure that, and we didn't before. So we should all probably, take this and use it to form our opinion of him.
It's especially in the media, it's especially amongst like a younger audience that tends to be predisposed to liking analytics. They want their team to do analytics. They love it. They love the concept of it until you come out with any sort of rating or metric that doesn't have the best player on their favorite team.
As long as it suits
rated,
them.
yeah, rated high, and then it's just, oh, you're ruining the game with your nerdery, and it's the same people who doing both sides of that, which is something I've always found interesting is the rejection of the model based on the results without It's basically exactly what Neil was talking about. It's like your analysis said something I wasn't prepared for, therefore your analysis must be wrong.
Yeah, so much I think of like human psychology is to make things more deterministic than they are. Like that's how our brain just makes mental shortcuts to live our lives. You know, we don't think about breathing, that sort of thing. So that's where sometimes it can kind of extend more than we probably want it to. And obviously, like another part of it is having disagreements with other people. Like I think that's another psychology thing where we don't like being in disagreement with other people. So when other people start disagreeing with us, we don't like it. But I found like for myself professionally, it's a lot better to live your life understanding, like, you know, searching out those disagreeing sentiments on subjects that apply to my job, understanding why that people feel that way. We don't need to have a conversation about it and both come to the same side at the end of it. I try to be okay with being uncomfortable with that, even though I think our psychology kind of makes us not want to do that. So that's where everybody's like, you need to be on my side, you're wrong, I'm right, or vice versa. And it's like, well, like we don't need to decide right here, right now, every time. Let's just take, you know, write down on record what everybody feels, maybe come back to it when we have better insight.
Absolutely. So, Brian, in your professional estimation, do you like see any examples of like confirmation bias and what people choose to accept versus not accept? Like, you know, the data tells them something about a player or a team that they might not like to hear, so they choose not to listen to the data, or the other way around either?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same kind of thing that Neil and Seth and others have talked about. As far as examples of that, I mean, I guess like I was involved along with Neil recreating our NBA real plus minus model, and you know, you start going out with the results of that, and you know, there's all sorts of, you know, it's people that, you know, generally like the list, but then there'll be a couple players that seem weird. It seem weird to us too, but they seem weird to someone, and it's just like, because of that one weird thing, it just sounds like they're dismissing the metric for some reason. And you know, you start looking into all these things, and in every single situation, there's a reason, you know, there's a reason in the data why the metric, you know, is too high or too low relative to what you think it should be. So, but it you know, it's hard to really explain a lot of these things. I think, you know, to go back to maybe sort of one of the previous questions, sometimes it's easier to get buy-in, maybe with the exception of the run block win rate that Neil was talking about, but sometimes it's easier to get buy-in with metrics that sound simpler. So for example, or where they have just a very straightforward interpretation, and it almost sounds like you could record this by hand, and it would be, so like an example is the pass block win rate, pass rush win rate. This got adoption internally in ESPN fairly quickly. I think one of the reasons is if I say pass rush win rate or pass block win rate, you can kind of like understand what it is already. If I say real plus minus, there, you know, there's like a one paragraph explanation of what it is, and it uses like 4 different data sources or something that you have to explain. If you say pass rush win rate, and you say, you know, we're using tracking data to determine whether a lineman won his block or won his pass rush, it's pretty straightforward to understand. It's almost hard to argue with. Like, you can show the video also and say, hey, see, this was a win, so we counted this as a win. So, you know, some of the wins, you know, the algorithm isn't going to be perfect in that case either. None of these things are perfect, but it's almost, you know, something simpler like that, if it's like a rate or a percentage, or something like that, a lot of times it's easier to get faster adoption and less sort of like pushback.
Sure. So,
Do you mind if I?
absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's also like, it's also useful when you kind of lean into, hey, this is a weird thing going on, we're going to write a story about it. So our new NBA metric, which we launched a year ago, even though it seems like 5 million years ago right now. Early on in it, Will Barton was very high in it. And we were like, why? And so we wrote an article about like, this is the thing that Raptor is seeing in Will Barton. And, you know, this is why he's number 6 on our list right now and is in there among the guys you would expect. And you would not expect him. And I think that kind of explanation of like, hey, this is what might be going on, this is what this guy is doing that we didn't expect, you know, from him and whatever, is useful and helpful in a longer term understanding of a new metric or a new model for your audience.
Absolutely. So one of the things I wanted to touch on today before we run out of time is the presentation of data that you get on TV is kind of limited, but with the advent of streaming, you can like put the game in a window and have an entire page of data that a user can interact with. So maybe I'll start with Alison here, but I'd really like to hear anyone else's thoughts. How do you see the presentation of data while someone is watching a game continuing to evolve?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question, because the bigger question is, what do we want the data to do? And what are people looking at the data for? The NHL is perhaps behind most sports in terms of they're just about to introduce player tracking and puck tracking, hopefully this coming season. And we saw some of this in the playoffs. And what we saw was, here's the players on the ice, here's the names of the players, and here's how fast this player went here. Fine, but what does that mean? And is it even relevant? And does it matter to the outcome of the game, or is this just a nice betting tidbit? So I think we have to know what we're presenting. And when we present, this is to Brian's point about what we call things and how we introduce things, it is incumbent upon us to make sure that when we put this data out there, that people understand what they're looking at, and whether it's predictive, descriptive, or something completely different entirely. But I think that the field is so rich for it, because I think that even with what Sara was just saying, if we understand these data points, we can find new nuance in certain players' games. We can understand a strength of this player that maybe isn't good, but he's really good at this one thing, for example. So I think that particularly with streaming with devices, I know on the NHL app, they're doing a lot of integrative work, bringing in shot flow and shot volume. And I think that people are ready for it. I think people like it. I think that they like seeing data that reinforces or challenges what they just saw. So I think it's very exciting. It's just really a great responsibility of us journalists and those who are responsible for presenting it, to present it in the right way and make sure it's just data about sports, but that it's used responsibly, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah. That's a great answer, I think. Sara, did you want to chime in on a question that was in the Q&A, or?
Oh yeah, I was just going to answer that in the Q&A if that's okay.
Sure, go for it.
So one thing I guess Brian and I can talk about from ESPN's perspective when it comes to broadcasts is we're constantly tinkering and experimenting with broadcasts. We do mega casts for college football playoffs. We do it for the MLB wild card. We do it for other events as well. And that's where our specific team is actually given a lot of leeway for at least the analytics version of that broadcast to experiment. ESPN's constantly trying to find the new things to put out there, find the new things that are interesting. And that's where, like, for me, I just see having more optionality about it, like having a plug and play visual setting. So you could have just the actual feed, you could have a bunch of overlays or not, optionality between the broadcasters. Something I noticed a lot of the analytics community is they want smarter broadcasters, but I think we all fail to realize how much of the vast majority of viewers are just average people turning on the TV. So that's where I want us to be able to have like a second audio channel for us, something like that. And then like the last thing I've noticed is if you watch like esports streams, the amount of information they put on the screen is ridiculous. And I think to me, what that kind of says is the younger generations are going to be much better at like digesting everything that's on that screen when there's so many overlays. There's so much information about the game on the screen that they can just handle that at a rate that I honestly can't. So that's the thing. I think another thing to consider too is the ability for people to process more information as time goes on. And if you go back and watch like an old sports broadcast of whatever sport you're interested in from 30 to 50 years ago, there might have been a game clock on it for some of the game, and that was it. And now we've got it on the whole time. There's tombstone elements showing little facts and stuff. Replays are happening much more, and all sorts of other visualizations are being used depending on the sport. So it's just a matter of progress happening and continuing forward at whatever rate makes sense.
Absolutely. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the Q&A is now, or has been now, the whole time. So there was a question that I think Sara wanted to touch on. Like, do you think players use statistics like Raptor in contract negotiations?
We have actually heard of a couple of players of doing that, and using that as one of the things they're advocating for themselves for, which is that's like what made the metric really real to me. I was like, oh, this has actual consequences. Wow. So that was kind of fun. I don't know if it helped that player. I hope so.
So I'll say that in the time I spent with the Bucks, like from the first off season till the off season I left, the degree of sophistication on the statistical packages we got from agents increased dramatically. Some of them are still exceedingly cherry picked and not at all convincing, but I do think that the existence of some of these sort of tentpole metrics in the world that have been vetted sort of by the community, and that the community kind of encompasses both the there is those find their ways into the
One thing I'll add real quick to that is I've seen job listings for analytics positions at multiple sport agencies before. So I think they're primarily doing that to understand who they want to target, which amateurs they want to target. But that's where, those people can then be on those conversations with the agents to tell them, like, here's the one sheet of numbers to show the team, to show them that we believe our guy is to this degree, good and deserves a certain number. And these are legitimate facts to back it up. It's not just like this is a neutral bystander to some degree. Obviously, you can always be selective with how you do it, just like how certain fans are. But it's certainly a way to add legitimacy to that conversation.
All righty. So I'll say thank.
So it appears that Trenton's getting a little frozen here right at the end. But thank you to all of our guests here. We're running up at the end of our time. Really appreciate you spending the time to come and join us. We have a couple of closing statements. So this is our end for the day. So this has been a culmination of several months of work from myself and Dr. Draper and the students that have put this on, Trenton Butz, Hunter Green, Alex Harding, Nayan Patel, Noah Ritchie, AJ Turner, Alex Williams, Bailey Weinstein. On the top of our program, I wrote that this is the first annual Sports Analytics Association conference, and we plan to stick to that. And we do want to continue to keep putting this out, and hopefully at some point we can do it in person. I think this was a pretty good start. We had 463 total people register for webinar room 1. We had 22 student research presentations from 11 different universities and 29 panelists. We can't thank the panelists enough. Of course, we'd all like to meet in person, but I think that this did give us a good opportunity to get a lot of panelists in where where we've eliminated that cost of coming in here and been able to really put together an excellent program. I'm really excited about how things went today, and I hope that we can continue to do this.